Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Pittsburgh Sports Memories Podcast. My name is Tim Hannon, and I am joined, as always, by my co host.
I'm Steve Wirt.
In this episode, we had the opportunity to interview the daughter of Myron Cope, Elizabeth Cope, and Dan Joseph. Those two have collaborated on a new book. It's out now. It's called Behind the Yoy. And we got a chance to ask them about Myron. Of course, Myron Cope, an iconic Pittsburgh figure. Many of us grew up listening to Myron, and we got a chance to just ask them about Elizabeth, especially about what it was like growing up as the daughter of Myron. And boy, did they give us some really insightful stories. So this podcast is just a taste, I think, of what you'll find in the book. We'll have links in our show notes for the book and for the YouTube channel, which also has a lot of good stuff. But for now, enjoy this interview with the authors of Behind the Yoy. So this week we've got Dan Joseph and Elizabeth Cope with us. They have written a book called Behind the Yoy, The Life of Myron Cope, legendary Pittsburgh Steelers broadcaster. You can pick up that book at Pittsburgh area Barnes & Nobles. You can also get it on Amazon. You can also read it on your Kindle. That's where I usually like to read books. So welcome, Dan and Elizabeth.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
So Dan, you've written some books on baseball history. What led you to wanting to write about Myron, and then how did the two of you connect to do this book?
I'm a Steelers fan from birth, almost my birthright. I grew up in Pittsburgh, and Myron was a guy. He was ubiquitous. He was inescapable growing up in Pittsburgh, and fascinating. And I always had some questions in the back of my mind, what made him tick, and I found out he had been a sports writer before becoming a broadcaster, and so it was just a area of curiosity. And then my wife, she knew a friend of Elizabeth, and this friend said Elizabeth had all of Myron's old uh, tapes and papers, scrapbooks and things, and communicated that Elizabeth wanted to do something with all this. And so we just kind of got each other's phone numbers and began talking. And in time, we decided we're going to do a biography.
So you mentioned, Dan, Myron kind of being inescapable. Elizabeth, I imagine that there must have been positives and negatives growing up for you, with that sort of being the way that he was for most of us who grew up in Pittsburgh.
For sure. Oh yeah, definitely. He there was definitely lots of ups and downs, that's for sure. We were stared at everywhere we went, and people interrupted us at dinner and things like that. And of course there was positives, but as a child, like a lot of those positives, you wouldn't necessarily like realize the full extent of it as a child, like, because you don't know any different. And also it's not like, oh, we're recognized or we get special treatment. You don't realize that when you're 5. I mean, you don't know that's happening, and you don't really benefit from it actually, because you're just a kid. So, but I only just like knew of him as my father. I didn't really understand any of that other stuff. I didn't even know what he did for a living as a kid. I mean, he was just my dad. So, I mean, I had the ups and downs everyone has with anybody's dad. As far as him being Myron Cope, I guess I was aware of that was like something different than what my friends had, but I didn't focus on it that much or pay attention.
Elizabeth, it's Steve Wirt. I'm the co-host with Tim. Now, was Myron the same person that he was at home as he was on the air with his public persona, or was that two different kind of people? Like he had a public persona and then it's just dad Myron at home.
He was the same. I mean, he never put on a false persona, but he definitely toned it down at home, or we might have murdered him. I mean, he didn't act like on the air like he did at home, but I mean, it definitely was who he was. I mean, he didn't say really yoy, but he tended to say oi, like oi vey, and like oi, and like
All the Yiddish expressions.
yeah, all the Yiddish expressions, and he also could get excitable. He had that kind of personality. He was type A personality for sure. He had a lot of energy. Um, in fact, whenever he was in the home, you were aware of it, whether he was speaking or not. Like when I was up in my bedroom, I knew if he was home because I knew the sound of his foot, like his footprints or whatever. When someone's walking back and forth in the house, like I knew he was home. And there was always, I don't want to say high tension, but there was definitely a feel in the house when he was there. Maybe some people would like to call it in a positive sense electric, but like his presence was known always when he was home.
That is related to something that we talk about in the book. Now, the Myron persona that everybody came to know on radio and TV, like Elizabeth said, it was related. It grew out of his own natural personality, but it was something that kind of was built. Aspects of that persona were built over time.
It evolved.
He evolved. Yeah, like if you listen to Myron, I listened to lots and lots of Myron Cope over the last 2.5 years doing this book. If you listen to Myron from, say, like the late 60s, he hasn't quite revved up yet. He's working on it. He's kind of it's like a comedian who hasn't quite found his lane just yet. And then by the mid 70s, he was on Steeler games especially, he was getting more excitable, more unleashing the yoys and things like that. And then you get up to about the time of Super Bowl 13. That's the full Myron. That is the Myron that everybody knows and remembers with just going off on these metaphors about ballet dancers and food.
Nijinsky, if I remember
Yeah.
correctly.
Nijinsky, yeah.
So this is different. Like, so the 60s Myron is different than now I'm a little younger, so I remember Myron more from the 90s. And I remember him wearing hammer pants.
Oh my
and,
God.
like dancing I think it was Can't Touch This, wasn't it? It's something
My
with
mom
a
and I hated those videos. He thought they were hysterical, but yes.
He always sang, like he always did comment on his morning commentaries on WTAE. He would sometimes sing, and yes, that was always part of the persona. But then the videos, that was more of a '90s thing, and apparently, yeah, he loved doing that, and people loved it. Climaxing with the Macarena video, the famous.
So Dan, you touched a little bit about early Myron, and Myron did write an autobiography, and I want to say that was like 2002. But there was much more to Myron's story that wasn't in that book, wasn't there?
Mm-hmm. I got to go through, with Elizabeth's permission, I got to go through all these boxes with his. He saved maybe not everything, not in a Rat Pack kind of sense, but he saved lots and lots of files of correspondence and contracts and things that I hadn't expected, like the early history of the Terrible Towel in terms of the original contracts and royalty payments and sales charts and things like that. And it was interesting to see how when they began selling it in '78, it took off. And for about a year and a half, the sales were just spectacular, and Myron was getting these big royalty checks, much of which he donated almost immediately to charity. And then when the Steelers stopped winning Super Bowls, all of a sudden the sales plunged. And he actually got a letter from Gimbel's department store. They were like the outlet. And they said, a very terse letter, when your royalty reaches the amount of $10 per month, we will send you a check. That's how much the sales had dropped off by 1981. And it kind of laid dormant for more than a decade. And then all of a sudden, in the Bill Cowher era, it took off again. That was something that hadn't been in his autobiography. And then just a lot of details about like how he changed his name at a surprisingly young age from Copeland to Cope. You could see a lot about how his writing career evolved as he was with the Post Gazette for 8 years, and then he branched off into magazines and let you get letters from editors about encouraging him to move up and move out. You can do this. You can be a success. A lot of stuff about his contracts. You could really go into great detail about his life and career.
That's interesting about the towel. I started going to Steeler games with my dad in the '80s when they were, not so good, and I hadn't thought about it, Dan, until you said it. But you're right. People were not waving terrible towels at the River Stadium in the '80s. It just wasn't a thing. And then I want to say it was like that first playoff game against the Bills where Cowher was the coach, and I sort of remember Myron getting on the radio and let's bring back the towel. And it's really been a staple ever since. But you're right, it kind of went away for a while, and people wouldn't remember that.
He actually faced a little bit of resistance trying to bring it back because I found this one newspaper columnist said, "Hey, it's time to move on from the '70s. The towels,
Mm.
the towel is this from the decade of tube socks and 8-track tapes, and let's try something else." But Myron would not hear of it, and he persisted, and especially the '94 seasons when it really came
Okay.
back.
Yeah, yeah, and I certainly get I get that mentality because I think again, Steve mentioned he and I are a little younger. We were born during the '70s and the time when the Steelers are winning Super Bowls, and then we grew up in this era where we were too young to experience all of that. And I remember Three River Stadium, they were still playing the Steelers polka and that kind of stuff. And this new generation was like, hey, we want our own championship and all that kind of stuff. But I don't know that anyone ever felt that way about the towel, right? The towel was just so iconic that, and it
Yeah.
didn't, and it came right back with when the Steelers kind of came back.
I mean, Myron did sort of engineer that. He found a new distributor and promoter for the towel. And of course, he was promoting it himself, and it hadn't really disappeared from anyone's memory, and no one had bad feelings about it. It was just waiting for the right moment, and when Cowher when the team got good again, the people just picked up the towel.
This can be Dan or Elizabeth here. How is Myron viewed by, I would say, his peers in the media? And you can, if you want to separate it into nationally and locally, I know you kind of touched on, like, there were some people saying that he should have moved on to bigger and better things, but I know, like, where him and Howard Cosell, like, they were kind of around the same time. What was their relationship like? Or even, I know later him and Madden, I don't know, Mark Madden got along, but some of those relationships, if you guys could get into.
Yeah, he was extremely close with Howard Cosell. They were very good friends. They liked each other ever since my dad wrote the article about him for Sports Illustrated that won an award. They were really close, and they had a kind of a sparring relationship. They were a lot of fun together. And I think like he got along with most of his peers. I mean, he always talked about the business was very competitive, for sure. And he dealt with some of that as well. And Mark Madden, I do not think they got along. At the end, especially, no. Mark Madden apparently just did not like my father. I don't know if he was, I don't want to say jealous. I mean, I mean, my dad didn't talk to me about like drama at the station or anything like that, but they didn't get along. But as far as everyone else, I feel like that he was well respected and liked. I think Mark Madden might be one of the only people I know that my father did not get along with, and I don't think they didn't get along in person. It was more like comments that were made like out of each other's presence. Like Mark would say things about my father, and my dad would hear about it. when they were face to face, I think they acted like they got along. I mean, that's my impression. But he was very close with Howard Cosell, and he had many opportunities to go to a bigger market. They called him from New York, LA, and he thought about it, is my understanding. He thought about it, and then I guess he wanted to stay in Pittsburgh, or I remember something went awry with like a tape he was sending forward, but he feels like they would have had him just mainly because his ratings were top in Pittsburgh. And I guess that's really the most important thing that they would be looking for in a bigger market, what your ratings are. And he always had the number one spot in Pittsburgh during his whole career.
Yoy in New York just wouldn't have been the same. I don't know. That would have been, definitely
Yeah,
weird. Yeah.
maybe.
Can I just add a couple comments to that? Yeah, he got along pretty much, I think, with everybody in the Pittsburgh market, especially that Bill Hillgrove was like one of his closest friends. He did have kind of a rivalry with the late Stan Savran, and that's one of the things we talk about in the book. But otherwise, and he and Sam Nover apparently had some sort of they've rubbed each other the wrong way, I think. But generally, he got along well with everyone. Now, in terms of going to other markets, some of the people I talked to thought Myron's style was so Pittsburgh based that he wouldn't necessarily translate that well to other markets, like Los Angeles. It's hard to see him doing his shtick in LA or in other cities, although maybe New York would have worked. I'm not sure. But yeah, he wanted to stay in Pittsburgh. The only other offer he seriously considered was when KDKA tried to hire him away a couple of times from WTAE, and he wound up getting a much bigger contract at WTAE both times that it happened. But he was very loyal to the station. He had a lot of friends there. And they treated him well when there were either he had health problems or there were other things he had to deal with, and they gave him time off. So I think he was happy where he was, both in the city and in the station where he worked.
He was very adaptable, though. Like he always said that he thinks he could have translated to other states, parts of the country. I think he definitely believed he would have been successful, but who knows? I mean, he was happy, and he wasn't all about like having the biggest stage or anything like that. He was happy and content. He wasn't overly ambitious in that regard.
So, folks, once again, the book is called Behind the Yoy. You can find that at Barnes & Noble or Amazon. We will post links to that in our show notes. You guys mentioned Howard Cosell before. Obviously, that was one of the more famous articles that Myron wrote in Sports Illustrated, was the profile. You guys also mentioned the YouTube channel where you've been uploading some of this great archival material you have. And he told a story years later, I guess, that Howard was kind of angry about the article at first, but then came around. Do you guys have any more insight on that?
He was angry about that article because my dad had to write. I mean, he was a writer. He wrote objectively. He couldn't just like sugarcoat things or only say this person like their good side, or he wanted to tell the truth. So he did. He told the truth of what he knew of Howard, and Howard didn't like that. And but it ended up being something that got a lot of attention. And Howard did like that. And so then he was okay with that. And they were friends again because people would, see Howard on, the streets of New York, and they'd say, oh, we saw you in sports. We read about you in Sports Illustrated. How wonderful. And so then he changed his tune and he was okay. But when he first read the article, he was upset. Apparently, this is how the story goes. My dad said that he didn't call him. And it was noticeable because he would call my dad up on the phone almost every single day while he was writing the article. And then when it came out on the newsstands, the phone was silent for a couple of days.
Interesting. What do you guys in this book? What is it that you would want people to know about Myron the writer? Because he really had a whole distinguished career before he started doing Steeler games and before he did the radio show. And you can actually still go back and read a lot of his stuff. Sports Illustrated has a great vault on their website where you can go back and read some of his old articles, and they're really, really well written and some really interesting insight. You know, he's not just writing like game recaps, right? He's doing human interest stories and things like that. So what is it that you guys would want people to know about Myron the writer?
Well, for me, one thing, like when he transferred over to broadcasting, he still was sort of like the writer, as far as like there is nobody, I don't think, in broadcasting history, I can safely say, even today, that prepared for a game more than him. As far as he didn't just go on the air and wing it. I mean, he did wing it, but like as far as like preparation, he researched every player on the Steelers roster, every player on the opposing team, tried to find colorful stories about them, background about them, nicknames from their childhood, so that whenever the opportunity presented itself in a broadcast, he could throw that out there. That's why he was so successful, because of he really worked hard.
When he was doing the magazine career, he would travel all over the place, and because he didn't want to just phone somebody up and do an interview, he wanted to get all the sights and the smells and the sounds that he could really make that person or that game or that setting really come alive. And I mean, there's a whole chapter on it in the book. He he wanted to be known on some level. I think to the end, he thought of himself primarily as a writer, and he wanted, when he retired, at his retirement press conference, he said he wanted to be remembered mainly as a writer. It was very deep within his personality, even after 30 years of broadcasting.
Yeah, he was always, when he was growing up, he was one of those people that always knew what he wanted to do for a living. Like when he went to college, a lot of people don't know what to major in. He always knew, he said he wanted to be a newspaper man.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to write in a newspaper. That was his like dream.
So you guys touched on this in the book when you said, Myron wasn't afraid to do things like touch on a player's race or religion. Obviously, things are different today than they were in Myron's heyday in terms of what you can and cannot say publicly without getting splashed all over social media. How do you think he'd be received today? Do you think this environment would have changed his approach at all? Or do you think he just would have had to have been true to himself no matter what and just dealt with whatever came with that?
He would have run into a lot more flack. Just if people would hammer him as they hammer almost everybody on social media, and someone as outspoken as he was, if he took the exact same approach today, he wouldn't have the relatively smooth sailing that he had throughout his career. The station protected him to some extent, and I'm not sure a station would be able to protect him now without facing a lot of protests online or from some various pressure group. I think he'd have to adjust partially.
I agree. I think if he had grown up in this era, I think he would know that what he could and could not get away with. I would like to think that he would have to adjust how outspoken he could be.
Yeah, so even without the social media, climbing all over everything kind of mentality, Myron still managed to cause some controversies. One that you guys have on the YouTube channel is the last game at Three River Stadium. He was calling the Washington Redskins the Washington Red Faces, and Daniel Snyder, the owner of the Redskins, apparently sent an employee in to tell him to stop. And Myron had a great reaction to that. Typical response to that. What other? You guys did a whole chapter called Myron the Contrarian. So what other controversies do you sort of delve into in the book that he got himself into?
Well, Okay, well, I mean, the one that probably got him in the most hot water was when Mike Tyson was on trial for raping like a beauty pageant contestant in Indianapolis. And Myron, without defending Mike Tyson, he said that this girl, she was only 18, I think, she should have known better than to go into Mike Tyson's uh, hotel room. And he said, he was implying that she was somewhat guilty for her own rape, as horrible as this sounds. And that was one of the few times people really did raise a hue and a cry, and there were a lot of telephone calls. And then it kind of died down. And then when Tyson was convicted, he said it again. And so there was another um, outcry. But he survived it. There was no, you couldn't do obviously a social media campaign in 1992. Um, that would be something that might cost him his job today, I think. And he was able to get away with other things like he was so popular that he decided no smoking signs did not apply to him. He would smoke in the WTAE studio, in the booth at Three Rivers. He would go to other stadiums and try to smoke there, and then a security guard would have to tell him to put it out. Um, One time, there was the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle. A columnist criticized him for speaking at a club that barred Jews, and Myron wrote the angriest letter to the Chronicle, and he ended it with saying, if this guy ever butts into my business again, I'm going to find him and bust every tooth out of his mouth. But they didn't print that. They were either saving Myron's reputation or the other guy's reputation. Yeah, I mean, these were things that, examples of him being, a little difficult to deal with, a little prickly, I guess one might say.
Yeah, and then you can just imagine today, right? Like that stuff would be Twitter headlines and everything else. And
People would be taking smartphone pictures of him, smoking cigarettes and
yeah,
inside, and he'd had hell to pay for things like that.
He did get into a fight once about the smoking on the Steeler plane going to a game that was interesting with Greg Lloyd, because Greg Lloyd did confront him and told him to put it out. And they had a standoff and he said no. And I guess Greg Lloyd like kicked one of his suitcases or something. And my dad said, you do that again and you'll get a letter from my attorney. And then they just both sat down and I'm like, Dad, what are you doing? Picking a fight with a guy like that? He's huge. But my dad wasn't afraid. And, he was so like, I wanted him to quit smoking. So obviously I was like, you don't need to be doing that. But you couldn't tell him anything.
Well, if Greg Lloyd can't get him to quit smoking, what chance did any of the rest
Yeah.
of us have?
No, it wasn't going to happen, unfortunately.
uh, the you guys talked before about the terrible towel. Elizabeth, you wrote some stuff in the book. That's obviously, like you guys said, an iconic Pittsburgh symbol, and people take their towels with them all over the world. But you wrote some very just kind of open and vulnerable and honest feelings about that in the book. Would you care to share any of those?
Yeah. Well, people always come up to me and say, "Oh, that's so wonderful what your dad did, giving all the money to charity." And I always agree with them that it's wonderful. And I mean, it is wonderful, but being his daughter, that's also was very painful for me because I'm not a martyr or a saint by any stretch of the means. And I like the lifestyle that money buys as much as anybody else. And I'm not sure anybody would be thrilled off the bat. Like, say your dad won like millions of dollars in the lottery. Would you love it if he just gave it to charity? Would you be so happy? So I touch into that. It's something that I've worked through. I can't change it. And it is nice, and that's probably where the money was meant to go. And you have to be philosophical about it and realize that that's, maybe that was just meant to be. There's forces we have no control over, and for the grand scheme of things. And if I was the only one that benefited from it, say he just left it to his daughter, would people would the Tao be real as successful as it is today? Would people love it? Would they buy it? Would they be, do you know what I mean? I think part of what people buy it for is because of, my dad didn't even benefit from it. He didn't, once when he gave it to charity, he didn't receive a dime from it, my father. So, I don't think I could do that. If I had a creation that was that big, I don't think I'd be able to do that. So, I go into that a little bit. I mean, I'm a lot better than I used to be as far as like bitterness or, when I was younger, that was hard. When I was much younger, after I accumulated some life experience, I realized that, people have lots of different reasons for doing what they do. And, you're not in somebody's soul to know why they do what they do. And I'm very forgiving of people.
Yeah, thanks for that. I agree with you. I think most of us would struggle with that decision. It would be difficult for most of us to admit that publicly. So kudos to you again for being so open and honest about it. Elizabeth, I have two special needs daughters, and they're my only daughters.
Okay.
But being involved with a lot of other special needs families, one thing I know that's a big struggle sometimes is when you have a child with needs, sometimes and they have siblings that don't have the same needs. Sometimes those siblings, it's a struggle to, make sure you tend to focus all your energy on the person that has the needs. And I just wondered if, part of that, did the Tao represent maybe some of that as well? Like everything's
Maybe.
focused on one place?
And I'm glad you brought that up because I totally forgot about that aspect. I mean, no, I didn't forget about that aspect of it, but I often think like, I don't know what it was like. I mean, Danny's older than me. I always grew up with him. I don't know how devastating it is to have a child that ends up having special needs. And I'm sure that tormented my parents. And I'm sure that went into my dad's decision as well. So I have to have empathy with that. And as far as Danny, I was always very close with him growing up. I mean, he went to school in Philadelphia for many, many years, and we would drive up there, and he would be at school 3 weeks, home a week, at school 3 weeks, home a week. And so we were constantly driving, and then he would come home for like a month at like Christmas and different. And he was real difficult as a child, screaming and yelling and kicking, and he had a horrible, I mean, he's nonverbal. He's real easy now. But growing up, I wouldn't say that our household revolved around Danny, and I was never jealous of Danny as far as attention, but I could see where in other houses that might happen. But I actually, when he went away to school, I hated it. I loved it when he was home. I liked it. So, but yeah, so I didn't know that you had two daughters that have special needs. I hope they're doing well.
It's a roller coaster, just like I'm sure it is with all those situations. But yeah, we did not have to deal with the having the siblings that maybe getting left out kind of a thing. So it's great to hear that you sort of made your peace with that early and actually found a comfortable spot there. And I can't imagine too the kind of stuff that he was dealing with in that era, right? Because in this era, you have all kinds of programs and schools are more understanding and all that kind of stuff. And back then, I'm sure it was much harder.
Whenever my mom would tell people that Danny was autistic, they'd say, "Oh, how wonderful that your son is artistic."
Oh, wow.
And she'd say, "No, not artistic. People didn't even know what that meant. That's how much like nobody didn't even know what the word autistic meant. They would always think she was saying artistic.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Again, time. It's amazing how much, just like you guys talked about with the social media environment. It's amazing just in the span of 30 to 40 years how much the world has changed, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, my dad had he spent a lot of money on my brother's care, and I think that also went into his decision about the town. Now he actually is one of the people that got a lot of things funded that people nowadays benefit from it, because back when my brother, like, medical insurance wouldn't pay for any of his care, they told my parents his condition was emotional, not and mental, it wasn't physical. And
Hmm.
my dad fought for it to be recognized as physical, and that he deserved to have a lot of this. Medical insurance should help out, and there should be programs and stuff. Instead, my dad was paying 6,000 a month out of pocket for my brother's school throughout growing up.
In 1970s, man.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it's not like he was making like the football players do now. I mean, this was making him go broke, literally.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons he went into broadcasting. While he was very successful as a writer financially, broadcasting paid more and enabled him to, and provided the major medical insurance to help him provide for Danny's needs.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Folks, once again, the book is Behind the Oi. You can get it at Barnes and Noble and Amazon.
Myron growing up, in what values kind of shaped him? Like what neighborhood? He's obviously from Pittsburgh, I'm assuming. And what neighborhood in Pittsburgh did he grow up in? Like what? Obviously, he has very strong family ties and family values, Elizabeth. Like
Yeah.
where did he get those from? Or can you
Um,
kind of?
I mean, I guess his parents, I was named after his mother, who passed away a few months before I was born. And in the Jewish tradition, you can't be named after anybody till they pass away. There's no, like, Bobby Jr., like when someone passes away. In fact, in the Jewish tradition, you're supposed to name people after like your relatives that have passed. But he was very close with his mother, and both his parents adored him. I mean, he was the favorite for sure. I mean, I kind of, my cousins talk about their moms, my aunts really got, like, left in the shadows, so to speak, because, he had three older sisters who were much older than him, like by 15 years and 8 years. So when he came along, the only boy, oh, just like the sun rose and set on my father. And, but they struggled. It was during the Depression, and he always had a job from the time he was like 11. Anything he could get paid to do, like a paper route. He set pins up at a bowling alley. And I know, like, they taught him, they had strong values, my grandparents. Apparently my dad, like, stole a comic book once, like, from a store when he was like 10. And, like, my grandfather marched him back to the store and, like, made him, like, give the comic book back and, like, pay restitution and write, like, a huge letter saying, "I'm sorry, I know that was wrong." And my dad always remembered that. He said that my grandfather took him by the ear and, like, marched him back to the store with the comic book. So, yeah, my grandparents, and my dad, he felt very responsible for his sisters, believe it or not. Like he was close to them, I think, and he was protective of them, I would say, more than, like, necessarily close. He was protective of them, I think, as, like, the only boy. Like, he felt this like on his deathbed, he actually said to me, "Please take care of my sisters. Please, like, make sure my sisters are okay." I don't know what he wanted me to do, but he was worried about them up until the end. He was always concerned about them. He would try and give them money all the time, and they were proud, and they never wanted to take it. They would never ask him for money, but, like, if he knew one of them was struggling, he would say, "Please take this," and they would say no. And so when he was at their house, he would hide money in their house for them to find, or he'd, like, shove it in one of their pants pockets or in their purse or something, because they would never accept it or ask. So he was a good brother, and he was a good son. But the house did revolve around him. He was spoiled. My aunt said that they'd be cleaning the house, like doing chores, and my dad would just be sitting on the couch, and they'd be like, "Can you move a minute so we can like dust around you?" So he didn't have to do as much as them. So,
Well, I think a little bit of that from what your cousin Marcia told me. There was some sexism going on there,
yes.
because the boys, they didn't have to do the housework. This is 1930s, 40s. The girls were expected to do the housework, and the girls didn't get a chance to go to college where Myron did, and
He
I
was
just
the
want to
only
make
one
that.
that got to wear braces, go to the dentist. My aunts all won extremely rare art scholarships to an art school in New York, and they weren't able to accept it because they had to work to help support the family, whereas my father was allowed to go to college. So yeah, that's a shame.
But I want to make just one related point. Um, Myron's upbringing, it was in Squirrel Hill, you know, it almost didn't have anything to do with who he became as as the guy that Pittsburghers came to know on radio and TV. I say in the book, if any boy was ever born to be a Pittsburgh Steelers broadcaster and icon, it was not Myron Cope. He was uh, he was from a not a sports minded family. He was obviously very small, too small to play most sports. Um, he just sort of latched onto the Steelers as a little kid, almost, no particular reason, and he wound up becoming a fanatic about them years before he began broadcasting. And it's not something anyone could have predicted, but when he joined the Steelers broadcasting booth, it was almost a natural transition because he had been hanging around the team on his own for years. He would fly to go see their games, various places. He would go drinking with the players in the '60s, like Bobby Lane and John Henry Johnson. They were all in their 30s at the time. He would go hang out with them at a bar in Brentwood. Um,
That would
you
never
know,
happen today.
No.
no,
Like
that's something
the
that definitely
media
didn't
and
happen.
players, could you just imagine them hanging out, having a beer together?
Yeah, there'd be a lot of cell phone videos of that on social media
Yeah,
once again. Yeah. Uh, we, we'll close with this. When I was a kid, my parents used to turn down the volume on the TV and turn on the radio to hear Jack Fleming and Myron Cope announce the games. And for a while, I think my brother and I kind of hated that because the sound was a tiny bit off and the commercials wouldn't gel together and all that kind of stuff. But then we sort of got used to it. I don't think we realized at the time, again, you didn't have, widespread social media. So I don't think we realized at the time that that's what a lot of other people in Pittsburgh were doing. And Dan, you devote a portion of the book to talking about that. And then you even interview some folks, including, I believe, Bill Hillgrove, who had the same experience of turning off the volume on the TV, correct?
yeah, yeah. He told me that that's what he did. I talked to several other people who used to do that. Actually, my dad and I tried that once, but it was like you just said, it was too far off. We just couldn't stand it. But one of the guys who did that was the guy who took the towel up to the top of Mount Everest. And then he launched his own foundation to raise money for charity in part because he was so inspired by Myron and the terrible towel. At one time, 50% of Steeler fans apparently did this. They would turn down the sound and listen to Myron. It would be interesting to see. There probably are still some people who do this today. I'd be interested to know how many. But it was just part of the phenomenon. He was just as Chuck Finder I'm not sure it's
Finder, yeah.
Finder.
Finder, yeah. The
Finder.
Post Gazette guy. Yep.
Oh, so yeah, he told me, Myron, he was like part of your family. It was the voice everybody wanted to hear call the Steeler games. It was familiar and comfortable and also very exciting and invigorating at the same time.
Yeah, definitely. His voice was iconic. His presence was iconic. My mom is in her 80s, and she still tells a story about calling into Myron's show. I guess everybody was really down on Mike Wagner was the player.
He's an underrated safety.
I went to
Yeah.
high school with his daughter,
Oh,
Okay,
wow.
Heather.
okay, nice.
It was a good safety.
And my mom called in to defend this guy, and I guess Myron said, oh, you make a really good point. Everybody is being too hard on him, and my mom still remembers that 50 years later, right? Because it was Myron Cope saying, she knew something about sports, right? And she had a good point. So I think that was kind of the experience in Pittsburgh for people.
Did she get a Copenhagen award?
With the sound in the background of the coconut falling. I always love the special effects.
Yeah.
Like Cope Cabana with the Barry Manilow was always fun.
Oh, that's funny.
My dad was he could be very kind and soft spoken. He was very sympathetic to other people. In fact, he was almost an easy touch. If he were maybe in a different line of work or wasn't well known, he really would have been one of those guys everyone took advantage of, because he was, if you told him a sad story, he was somebody that really would try and do things to help. I mean, he was very kind. A lot of people probably don't know that. Really was. He's nicer than I am. He's, but I try to emulate both my parents. They were both special, I think. My mother as well.
Yeah, and I think you talked about, him and Howard Cosell sparring.
Yeah.
I think some of the audio you hear from him years ago, Steve and I also dug up a clip of him and Eleanor Kane, the NFL writer. They were kind of sparring with each other, and it sounds mean-spirited, but then you can sort of, if you listen more closely, you can see, okay, these people are friends. They're really not hating on each other. They're just sort of verbally sparring, almost like locker room kind of sparring. So that seemed to be part of his personality too.
Yeah, he never wanted to be mean-spirited, when it came to, and he got hurt if people said things about him that were nasty. That's the only reason, I mean, he didn't dislike Mark Madden. I don't dislike him. I don't even know him, but he would get hurt if somebody said something that was nasty, as anybody would.
Sure. Absolutely. Especially, somebody in the public eye like that. All right. Once again, folks, the book is called Behind the Oi. It's out now. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it at Pittsburgh area Barnes and Nobles. You can read it on your Kindle. If you like what you hear in this episode, you're going to get a lot more great stuff in that book. So go out and get that today. Dan and Elizabeth, thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
I
You're very
appreciate it. It's been great.
It's a good conversation.
I enjoyed it.
Thanks, everybody, for listening. Thank you so much for supporting our little show here. Please check us out on Facebook or on Twitter. We actually now have an option where you can text the show. That's in the show notes. And we'll catch you next time.